in 2021, the average New Zealand house was worth 28 times more than it was worth in 1981. The average share on the NZX 50 index was worth 10 times more than it was in 1981. So any investor is going to be piling yet more money into housing because the returns are not only better, they're also tax-free. Kia ora koutou, a warm welcome to Locked Out with Craig Reine. By day, I'm the economist and director of policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. But by night, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. Can I start by thanking all the listeners and viewers for the kind words and support that you've shown over the first 2 episodes? It really makes a difference here. If you like this sort of analysis and think that others would too, recommend us to your friends or even your enemies. Also, give us a recommendation wherever you get your podcasts. It helps get the word out. Here at Locked Out, we're always interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know and what numbers are making them say, is that right? You can be in no doubt if you're thinking it, we are too. So get in touch. I'm on X, Blue Sky, and on Substack. We want to hear how we can better help you understand what's really going on and how you can help navigate the numbers being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. On the show this week, we're extremely delighted to have journalist, podcaster, one-man media mogul Bernard Hickey with us to talk about housing in New Zealand. Bernard's long been telling New Zealanders about the problems of the housing market and the challenges it's creating in the wider economy. He's the author of one of my favourite phrases about New Zealand, that it's a housing market with an economy tacked on. Here at Locked Out, we've been delving into the housing data to show how things have been going wrong for a very long time in housing. The 6th Labour government was elected in part to solve housing. Its Kiwi Build policy became synonymous with promising more than you can actually deliver. The coalition government has been in for about half its term now, and it promised to put downward pressure on rents by giving landlords very large tax benefits. Given that rents are now running at nearly twice the rate of general inflation, rents are running since the election at approximately 6%, as opposed to 3 and a bit% for inflation. I think it's fair to say this is another area in which a delivery has yet to occur. An area where delivery is definitely not occurring is in construction. Building consents in 2025 are down by more than a third, or 33%, from their peak in 2022. There are more than 13,000 fewer people working in construction since 2023. This is despite the fact that the population has increased by 223,000 during that period of time. Not that we were ahead of the curve prior to that. In 2021, the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research estimated that we were around 80,000 units of housing short back in 2021. We were starting from a bad place. Housing is also an issue because access to warm, dry, safe housing is such a challenge for some people in New Zealand. Homelessness is increasing across the country, especially in urban centres. I would love to give you more information about homelessness. In New Zealand, the Homelessness Outlook, a publication from the Ministry of Business and Urban Development, has been stopped. I'd love to tell you about what's happened to children who leave emergency housing, but the Minister for Social Housing, Kaka, said he isn't concerned. Alongside removing evidence on energy markets, stopping the collection of energy poverty data, there's a theme about data emerging from this government. Housing's one area which appears to be missing in budget so far, though, in terms of this budget. There have been plenty of pre-commitment announcements for defence, billions of dollars for new helicopters, for example, but nothing at all has been announced for housing. It's as if all of our problems in housing have gone away. Let's see if that's true with Bernard now. Bernard, thank you so much for coming on. Can you introduce yourself to the very few viewers, listeners who don't know who you are?
Sure, Craig, sure. I'm a housing tragic. I'm a former financial news journalist and editor, helped build a couple of news websites here in New Zealand. And now I produce a daily email newsletter called the Kaka. And I spend all my time looking at charts and reports and talking to as many people I can to understand what on earth's gone wrong with our housing market.
Well, can I ask you the first question? As a foreigner who came to New Zealand 12 years ago, why are New Zealanders so obsessed with housing in New Zealand? There are TV shows galore, there are newspaper articles galore, there's endless commentary. Why are we so obsessed with housing in New Zealand?
Because it matters more than anything else. I have a theory, the housing theory of everything, which says that because we don't have enough warm, dry, affordable homes, it changes the nature of our politics, our economy, our health, our productivity, everything. Because unlike a normal country, it is brutally expensive to own a home, and even more so actually to rent relative to our incomes. And the quality of our housing is very poor. Over the years, we've had very strong pop 1.5 to 2% per annum per year. And that has been much faster than other countries. But unfortunately, we haven't built enough housing, and our market is broken to the extent that the normal supply response you'd expect in any sort of normal market simply hasn't happened. And it's meant, in combination with the tax advantages of putting money into residential land, that everyone in New Zealand knows in their bones that the first thing you need to do in any financial, social, human sense is buy a house, get on the ladder, gear up, and then you become rich. And if you're renting, then you're in real trouble and you need to do anything possible to get onto the ladder. And that includes, marrying up, buying lotto tickets, whatever it takes to get into the housing market. Because if you don't, you really can't have stability, health, a stable family life. And frankly, you won't have enough money to survive if you get to retirement, particularly if you're still renting.
Because we've had a quick look at this. So the data elves have been working at locked out round the clock. And we've had a quick look at this. And if we go to chart 8, we can see this has been a long run problem in New Zealand. We're able to demonstrate, going back to 1960, quite how aggressively prices have been accelerating in New Zealand. In 1960, the average house price, according to an article from 2010 by a B. Hickey, was $6,696. But if we now head to where we are now, it's well over $800,000 just inside that sort of 60-year period. So you've seen this incredibly fast acceleration in growth, well ahead of anything that you've seen in terms of the stock market or any other asset in New Zealand. And what that's meant, if we go to slide 9, is that when we look at the hours that you need to work in order to buy the average house, you needed to have worked around 6,000 hours back in 1960. But it's now, it's now just shy of 20,000 hours of work. So a more than trebling of the number of hours of work just to buy the same average house in New Zealand. So is this and you can see since the 1980s and the deregulation in the 1990s, the incredibly quick acceleration of that house price growth. Is this something that's been a long time coming? Is this something that we've been doing wrong for a really long time, or is this just a more recent, i.e., last 10 years issue?
Yeah, it's really gotten very, very bad in the last 20 years. It was already quite bad, let's say in 2000 or so. And when I first started reporting in depth on this from 2003 onwards, I was sort of surprised that it was continuing to rise, because it already looked expensive relative to incomes, more expensive than most other countries, and particularly Auckland at that point. That, of course, has spread to other parts of the country, and it has continued to get worse. In fact, the real worsening happened between 2003 and 2022. And then we had various points of explosive growth, in particular between 2002 and 2007, again between 2011 and 2015 or 16. And then the last one, of course, was during COVID, 2020 to 2021. There's a combination of things going on here. You could argue it's a perfect storm over the last 20 years, and it's a storm built by some political choices that continue to be made. It's a storm built by some things happened with interest rates, some of which have nothing to do with us. And it's a storm built by the politics of wealth. So let's just pick that apart a bit. I think the original sin in our political economy, and particularly around housing, was made in the late 1980s, when the fourth Labor government decided to reform the tax system and bring in both a GST and a much cleaner, simpler, hard to get around income tax system, the PAYE tax that we know and love now. And the whole idea was to make it much simpler and to remove some of the advantages that were there for wealthy people. Back in the early 80s, if you were wealthy, you could put an awful lot of money into a pension scheme, and in effect, you'd get a subsidy from the government. You wouldn't have to pay tax on the money that you put into that. And rightly, the government of the day, a Labor government, said, we need to get rid of this. We shouldn't be giving a special treat to rich people to put money into a pension. And then everyone thought, oh, that's fine. We need to also get rid of the special treat we have, which is not to tax capital gains on residential property. And everyone thought, oh, yeah, we'll get round to that. We'll just get rid of that pension thing. We'll bring in the GST. We'll flatten the tax system. And we'll do that at the end. And that was the deal. In fact, in 1989, the then Finance Minister, David Kagel, proposed a capital gains tax at the beginning of December. And back then, the Labor government was in its last year of a 6-year stretch and was very unpopular. And so in 1990, it was elected out, and the capital gains tax was never put in. So it's a bit like, we've got this perfect tax system and it's all ready to go, except for this one piece of the puzzle, which was the capital gains tax, and it never went in. Now, at that point, it wasn't too much of a problem. But over the years, as interest rates have fallen and as banks have gotten much better at lending money into the housing market, the combination of that has meant that regular mums and dads have worked out the best place to put any spare money they have is into a deposit in a house, either that they live in or several houses. And then for the house price to rise, and because you've got a lot of borrowing, the leveraged after-tax gains in housing are spectacular. And not just a little bit better than shares or a little bit better than, putting your money into bonds or retail property or something else. They are spectacularly better, particularly after you think about the risks involved in the volatility. Remember, for most of that time, house prices have never fallen. And if they did fall, at most it was 5 or 10% for a year or two, unlike stock markets, which can go up 50%, down 50%. And for a lot of New Zealanders, the choice between putting your money into the stock market or putting your money into the housing market, that was really made in 1989. It helped, of course, that New Zealand had the worst share market crash in the world. So that perfect storm of falling interest rates, the tax advantage, the awful performance of alternative investments, and then the final thing, I believe, was the Resource Management Act and the fiscal approach, the way that governments operated on both sides of politics after 1990, which was to almost all the time, every time, all over the place, focus the government on getting back to surplus if the government happened to be in deficit, and to reducing government debt. This was like a sacred challenge. You know, Michael Cullen infused this into his bones. So did Ruth Richardson. So did Helen Clark. And actually, so did Grant Robertson. They were, when push comes to shove, more focused on debt reduction and getting back to surplus than they were in investing in infrastructure. It's why we've got infrastructure deficits. And the combination of the Resource Management Act, which made it much easier to stop things happening, and the governments, and we're both talking central and local government, because the central government set the rules for how local government operates. The combination of those two things meant we didn't get infrastructure built for housing, and we didn't get new housing built, because both governments, but particularly national, did not build social houses. And because of the combination of all of these things, not enough infrastructure, not enough new land being developed, released for housing, the tax advantages, the falling interest rates, it was like, oh boy, if I happen to be born in the late 60s, early 70s, I am set, because I could buy a house cheap and then ride a pathway to millionairedom without doing anything. And that's where we are now. We've got a whole generation looking at that and going, well, I can't afford that. Your chart pointed out that you'd have to work for 2.25 years for 24 hours a day for 365 days a year to buy a house, which, you know, it's just not possible. Again, unless you've got help from your parents or you are very, very attractive, and particularly to people who are rich.
Because the bit that I was going to ask you about is, you know, it's quite clear that the deal is now a loaded deal for younger people in New Zealand. We've got a housing market where back in the 1960s, essentially 3 years of annual salary would buy you a home. Now it's 9 in terms of that ability to buy you that same house, the average house in New Zealand. Just to be able to afford the deposit on that means years more savings. It means deferring doing things like starting a family. It means if you've got debt from university, you've got to pay that back and save in order to, you know, to buy a house. All of this acts
and
as
it actually gets worse when you look at it, because those people like me who were able to buy a house for, you know, $100,000 or whatever, they got to that point without having to pay student fees. Also, particularly during the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the government used to help first home buyers a lot. So, for example, they would capitalize your child benefit, and then they would give you a 3% loan, and then the Ministry of Works would pay to build all the pipes and roads and clear the ground for a new suburb. And then the government would also guarantee to house builders that they would buy their house back if it wasn't sold in the new suburb. So it's like, talk about win-win-win if you happen to be buying a house in 1986 or 1993, and talk about lose-lose-lose if you're trying to buy a house in 2023, because not only have prices shot up, not only have is it more difficult to save the money, simply you have to work for longer, but you're also having to, you know, pay back your student loan. You're not getting help from the government in that same way, and the government collectively is not helping to get these suburbs or the infrastructure built at the same time.
So what I'm hearing you say, Bernard, is that it's not avocados. It's not avocados on toast. It's not frothy coffees in various places. It's not other lifestyle choices by young people. Structurally, there have been huge increases in wealth for some groups who were lucky enough to be around when assets were cheap. They've been giantly inflated because of an undersupply of housing. They've been giantly inflated in value because of the availability of finance from banking institutions and others that were deregulated in that space. And as a consequence, some people lucky enough to be born in a particular period of time are enjoying the benefits of that change, and others will be paying for it for a very long time. Is that a fair summation of where we're at? We're playing this generation game with housing in New Zealand.
That's right. And it's a generation game where we don't actually talk to each other in very clear terms about it. So what's gone on here is that a generation who bought their houses between the 70s and the mid 90s are now millionaires. They may have had children, and some of them may have done well enough to be able to help those kids out to get into a home. So the kids are on the ladder. They're fine. Not really comfortable like their parents, but they'll survive. Those people who got born too late, simply by accident, now have very little chance under their own steam. And so there are some people who own homes who perhaps can't afford to help them out, help their kids out with deposits, or don't think that it's their job. They've got a Harley Davidson they prefer to buy rather than give a deposit to some lazy kid. So there's a whole bunch of people going, well, I don't think it's a problem. It was hard when I was buying a house in 1989. Look, interest rates were 25%, and it was really hard. And I didn't have any avocado on toast. There was no avocado in 1989. Or this is fun as well. I didn't spend all my money on flat whites. There was no flat whites. It was just instant coffee. That's what we had back in my day. And so, that seems like a reasonable thing to say. But when you simply look at the numbers as you have with your charts, the amount of time you have to work to save a deposit, let alone afford the home, is impossible. And the problem is now that we're stuck. It's a bit like some sort of Stockholm syndrome thing. We've got ourselves stuck. Those people who own a home and those people who vote, particularly the older ones, are in this place. It's a gilded cage. And they sort of know in their bones that it's not going to work. It's not going to work for their kids. It's not going to work for their neighbors' kids, the ones who are renting, or the neighbors they still know and talk to who are renting. And it's holding back the entire joint. The people who have kids in rental properties, they're having to bounce from property to property because private rentals turn over so quickly. Their kids are going through 3-4 schools before they get to the age of 10 or 11. The kids who are in private rentals, let alone Kāinga Ora homes, which have been in the past badly maintained and they make people sick, particularly kids. There are tens of thousands of kids who have to go to A&E every winter because they've got skin infections or chest infections. And the public pays thousands of dollars a night to have those kids in a home, and then we send them back to the same cold, moldy rental, which is costing their parents too much and forcing them to have 3 jobs, and they bounce on to another school in 18 months. It's
So can I talk to you about
brutal.
that one, Bernard?
It is
I think
poor. Sure.
Because I think if we go to chart 10, one of the things we can see is the data elves here have been working out the hours worked in order to pay the rent for those on the minimum wage. And in theory, economic theory, generally speaking, would tell you that as wages rise, rents rise. So those two should be linked, because the productivity of a property and the productivity of a worker, should be rising at roughly the same rate. Instead, what we've seen since 2009 is that for those on the minimum wage, in order to pay for the median property, so again, the one in the middle, they've had to work 3 hours at work extra every week just to pay the same rent on the same median property. Now, you might say minimum wage workers wouldn't be buying the median property, not the one in the middle. So we've also done this for the lower quartile properties, i.e. the lowest value 25% properties available in the country. And again, we can see for a lower quartile, from 2009, they were working 22 hours in order to buy that lowest 25% property. And now they're working 25 hours in order to do that. So that's 3 hours a week at work just to pay the same rent on the same property. Now, if you multiply that out across a year, in terms of how many days at work that is, that's an extra 19 and a half days at work just to pay the same rent on the same property. And so that essentially acts as a cash grab by the landlord during that period of time. So, I mean, to me, it's quite clear that it's not just in the private purchasing market, it's also in the rental market that we have deep problems in New Zealand, and we have very clear winners and losers. in this market?
Absolutely. Because the way that the housing market has developed over the last 20 years and the understanding, again, in our bones, that leveraged investment in residential property wins out over everything. And you need to desperately, desperately get in there. And once you're in there, you need to leverage up as much as you can, as fast as you can, to maximize the amount of capital gain that you get, has meant that, for example, those lower quartile homes, the ones that normally get rented to people on the minimum wage, have been in the hottest demand for people who are looking to buy rental properties. And of course, we've seen the debates over the last decade or so where first, actually, the national government brought in this so-called bright line test to try to impose some sort of slowdown on the rental property investment game. And then the Reserve Bank had to get involved as well to slow it down. Firstly, they wanted to slow it down for first times, which they did through the LVRs. And just recently, they've had to do it again by toughening up the LVRs and then bringing in a debt to income multiple control. Because this is the truly scary thing, Craig. Brace yourself. If there was no Reserve Bank restrictions on residential property landlords, and if we had no restriction on how to claim interest against tax and no bright line tests, as we saw for most of the last 6 or 7 years or so, depending on which test you're looking at, we could easily have doubled house prices again. And you might think, surely that's not possible. Surely the landlords couldn't afford it. Well, here's the really shocking thing. You know how when you own a home and you take out a 20% loan, an 80% loan because you've got a 20% deposit,
Yep.
and you think, well, 80% loan to value ratio, okay, that's a bit tough, but that's sort of reasonable if you're buying your first home. Actually, the collective amount of equity that residential property owners have, landlords in particular, is something like 20 to 30%. So what that means is, the amount of debt they've got is 20 to 30%.
Yep.
So what that means is landlords could gear up a lot more if they were allowed. And the banks would do it if they were allowed. But at the moment, they're not. And I think this is going to be one of the most interesting tests for this government, is whether or not it manages to force the Reserve Bank or suggest or cajole the Reserve Bank into releasing the restrictions on bank lending that are there at the moment, particularly as interest rates fall. And ironically, it's becoming quite desperate for the government because the fall in house prices that we've seen between 2022, the end of 2022, and really now, so 3 years now, is the longest and deepest fall in nominal terms we've ever seen in our history. And actually, in real terms, it's even more. And so for a lot of homeowners and buyers and rental property investors, they're going, gee, that seems a bit different. Do I really want to buy into this market, which is still falling, because it is? And I'm not going to make my capital gains if house prices fall a bit. I'll just wait. So everyone stands back. So all the buyers are standing back at the moment. And that means we've got this stagnation. And just like any engine that's not working, and the housing market with bits tacked on economy at the moment is definitely an engine that's not working properly. If you want to really clear it out, how do you clear it out? You squirt some nitroglycerine into the engine, and then you rev it up to blow the smoke out. And so one way to get the economy going again is to squirt some really cheap and juicy loans, leverage into the house market to blow out the cobwebs, get house prices rising again above their previous peak, and get everyone again thinking it's a sure thing. You can't lose. You always win with property. And for the government,
I was going to ask you that question, Bernard. Sort of, what do you think has been the impact of that growth over the past 40 years on the New Zealand economy? Because you would think if there's an asset, the average in 2021, the average New Zealand house was worth 28 times more than it was worth in 1981. The average share on the NZX 50 index was worth 10 times more than it was in 1981. So any investor is going to be piling yet more money into housing because the returns are not only better, they're also tax free. So, what sort of impact has that rising housing market had on New Zealand economy and jobs and growth and our incomes generally?
Well, so there's lots of quite nasty little ways in which this is fed through into falling productivity growth in New Zealand. And I'll start with one really obvious one, which is, let's say you're in your early to mid 20s, you're a hotshot tech wizard programmer, you've had some really juicy years of work at Deloitte or EY or whatever, but you've got this brilliant idea. What you want to do is set up an online trading marketplace, and you want to call it Trade Me. And you think, gee, I've managed to save up, $30,000 or $40,000, and sure, I'll be eating noodles for the next 3 years, but this could make me really rich. And so what you do is you don't take the full-time job. You jump out and you work in your garage and you build Trade Me, let's say. And that was possible in 2003. That's what Sam Morgan did. And luckily, he had some other friends who were able to do the same, and his parents and family were able to choose to put money into this crazy online startup because they could afford to, because they had some spare money, and because in 2003, it still made sense to do that stuff. Now it wouldn't. Gareth Morgan puts his spare several tens of millions of dollars into land. And what this does is it suffocates entrepreneurship so that lots of small, interesting businesses don't get built. It suffocates business investment because basically businesses, like everything else, they're run by people. And when people make a profit and they've got some spare money, you can either choose to put that money into the business, or you can take it out and put it into your own personal savings and your own personal investments. So for a lot of businesses, and there's a lot of small businesses in New Zealand, first thing they do when they can make a profit, they don't put it back into the business or buy another business or make it more efficient or put some new kit in or train their staff. They go straight out and straight into that 17th rental property or whatever it is, because they know that's where the money is. So that's one example. The second example is a sort of a really insidious one in our political economy, which is that the way that this current situation is set up, it makes sense politically to offer income tax cuts to voters. Because in essence, if you are a voter and you want to get rich, what you need is as much disposable income as you can to be able to subsidize your third rental property with a big loan to get rich. So if you can offer rental property investors a tax cut and you keep tax off the capital gain, it's much more likely you get elected. And it's the same for both parties. I mean, both parties have played this game of offering tax cuts to get into power and not taxing capital gains. And it's worked for them because, again, this is the dirty little secret of our political economy. To win an election, you don't have to win every vote. You only need to win that 4 or 5 percentage points worth of swing voters in the middle, if you like. And the way that our politics has worked, it tends to be older people in the suburbs, in the provinces, in the outer suburbs of the big cities, with families, with standalone homes, are the ones who are these swing voters. And
So
the last thing they want to do is agree to a capital gain. Sure.
Talking of elections, if I can ask you one final question, if I was to make you prime minister for a day, what would be the thing that you would do to deliver change in this area? What would be the thing that you would see would really help rebalance the playing field and really help solve the housing crisis we have both in rental and in property ownership in New Zealand?
Well, I would offer all of those voters in the middle, those swing voters, those mums and dads who sort of feel in their bones that it's not quite working for their kids or their grandkids. I'd say to them, hey, here's a deal. We will make housing affordable and healthy and safe again for your kids and your grandkids so that they stay in New Zealand, so they don't go to Australia or wherever else. So you get to see them grow up. You can play with them at the local playground or in the backyard. You can look after them in the middle of the night when mum and dad are sick or whatever, because you'll be close by, be there to help them. But the deal is you give up some of those capital gains that you've made over the years, not all of them, just a little bit at the margins, at the edges. You pay a little bit extra per year in tax, and we'll invest that money in making sure your kids have affordable, warm, dry rental property in cities that it's comfortable to go around and, to drive or to go on the bus or the train or to cycle or whatever, with good playgrounds and all of those things. Here's the deal. We will tax you every year on the residential land value of the properties you own. Small amount, let's say 0.5%. And sure, if you can't afford the cash right now, that's fine. We'll just we'll let that roll up in the same way you do with rates actually at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And when you sell the property, then we'll tax you. So we're not going to bankrupt you right now. Here's 0.5% per year. That goes into a fund, and we use the money from that fund to pay for the infrastructure, the water, the public transport, all of those things we need to guarantee that we build enough homes. And I'm not talking 10,000 or 100,000. I'm talking more than 1 million new and refitted homes in our biggest cities, so that your kids and your grandkids can be with you. And that's the deal. You may have to give up, $5,000 or $10,000 a year, but the payoff is that you'll be living in a much happier, healthier country with your kids and your grandkids, and you'll never have to answer that question at that dinner party conversation or at the Christmas party table. How come I can't afford to live in New Zealand, but you're here as a millionaire? Why didn't you either help me, or why didn't you vote to change the situation? That's what I'd say.
Well, as the part owner of a 6-year-old, Bernard, that certainly sounds appealing to me. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you so much for talking about housing. We'd love to have you on in the future. I'm sure our viewers would be very keen to have you on, talk about lots of other issues. Thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Ka kite. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks to Bernard for that fascinating conversation. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. The first job of any government should not be to make a bad situation worse. Sadly, government instead has chosen budget cuts to housing at Budget 24. The expenditure allocated for housing and urban development at that particular budget was cut by $1.5 billion overall. The cuts include cuts to contracted emergency housing, cuts to large-scale projects for state housing through Kāinga Ora, reduced asset maintenance and personnel at Kāinga Ora. We cut the new supply and capability of Māori housing. We cut progressive home ownership. We cut rangatahi youth transitional housing. These are some of the most vulnerable children in the country, and we cut the support for housing for them. We cut the first home grant scheme. And this is before we get to ending the state house building program. There are currently 19,308 applicants on the public state house waiting list, and each one of those applicants represents a family in desperate need. So this is the ideal time to stop the building of new state housing through Kāinga Ora. And in October 2024, the Minister of Housing, Chris Bishop, axed 69 housing projects totaling 532 homes. A further 2,000 homes in the planning stages were also being reassessed, which is code for cut in the future. Now, Kāinga Ora housing is built to a better standard than lots of private market housing. Many of the houses that we have in New Zealand are actively making us sick. According to the last census, 1 in 7 homes in 2023, or 14%, had mould over A4 size, always or sometimes. 288,252 homes were always or sometimes damp. Housing overcrowding, where there aren't enough beds, is back on the rise. In 2021, more than 9,500 children aged under 6 were hospitalized with illnesses such as respiratory tract infections, likely caused by inadequate housing. So again, this is the perfect time to roll back standards on home insulation, as Chris Penk, the the Minister for Building and Housing, is proposing to do. A scheme that's been variously described by industry experts as bonkers, outrageous, unbelievably short-sighted, and unacceptable. Yet housing affordability continues to get worse for many, and security of shelter, either in the form of affordable renting or affordable home ownership, is becoming more difficult. Kiwis spent 30% more than the OECD average on keeping a roof over their head, and we're the second last in the OECD for housing affordability. Unfortunately, we aren't second top for workers' incomes. That's why there's a real need for us to really examine what does good housing look like in New Zealand. Why our housing is so expensive, given we're a largely empty country covered in building materials called trees. Why is our housing market so far out of line? It's hard to argue with the findings of the UN Special Rapporteur for New Zealand, Liliana Fahare, who said, at the root of the crisis is a speculative housing market that's been supported by successive governments who've promoted home ownership as an investment, while until recently discontinuing the provision of social housing and providing inadequate tenant protection. I do think that means we have to look at the taxation treatment of housing, as Bernard talked about on the podcast. And we have to ask ourselves the question, if our lack of a capital gains tax is working for us. The evidence in this show is that it's not. Now, the usual economic update that we deliver at this point in time has been overshadowed somewhat by the decision of the government to change pay equity legislation. The government decided that ending a pay gap that was supposed to have been ended by the 1972 Equal Pay Act, a mere 53 years ago, is too expensive. I honestly didn't think that the National Party would stoop this low. In a cowardly move, they've stolen from low-paid female workers to cover the fact that they could never make their promises at the election work. I hope we can all share some solidarity with the affected workers and tell the government that this action is completely unacceptable. Yesterday, unemployment data released by Stats NZ showed the ongoing weakness in the labour market. Whilst the headline rate of unemployment remained the same, there was falling employment, falling hours of work, and nearly half of all workers got a pay rise less than inflation. Overall, the number of people working full-time fell by 45,000 in the last year, whilst the number of people working part-time rose 25,000. There are now 37,000 more people unemployed than at the last election. Māori unemployment rose to 10.5%, and Pacific people's unemployment is at 10.8%. Unemployment in Auckland is 6.4%. Employment fell in manufacturing, construction, retail, education, and in healthcare. There are now nearly 3 million fewer hours being worked in the economy than this time last year. Now, the weakness in the overall economy is also being reflected in the wage data. Total weekly gross earnings, so the total amount of wages being earned by people in the economy, that rose by 2.4%, which is less than inflation, which is currently 2.6%. And that's the worst rate since September 2021, which essentially is the end of COVID. 41% of workers saw no pay rise at all. And it's clear that many workers are struggling to get the wage increases that they need to keep up with the cost of living. Those proposed changes to pay equity will only make that worse. Youth unemployment again continues to rise. There are now 70,700 15 to 24-year-olds unemployed in New Zealand. 96,600 are not in employment, education, or in training, and that's up more than 16,000 since March 2023. There's no plan to help those younger workers, and they're bearing the cost of current employment change. Failing to tackle that problem will just lead to years of costs in the future, and all the economic evidence is the more we can do now, the more the economy will benefit in the future. Without changes to the overall government's economic approach, things will likely get worse. In 2022, New Zealand was 6th in the OECD's global rankings on unemployment. We're now 18th. Unemployment's lower in Australia, the UK, and the US, and the budget will likely see forecasts for unemployment rising in the future. It's time to change course. Now, we'll also see later this week some new data from the Financial Stability Report from the Reserve Bank telling us how healthy our financial entities are, and how much profit and actions our banks are making. So we'll look forward to that. But later in the week, we'll also see data on migration. That's particularly important. Migration appears to have plateaued. If it starts falling again and net migration starts to fall, that will be a really big indicator of problems to come, both for the government at the budget, but also in the economy. Migration over the past 10 years has been a huge driver of growth. Thanks so much for joining us here on Locked Out. We hope you found it in parts maddening and in parts enlightening. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review or a recommendation on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you download. Thanks again to Bernard Hickey for his thoughts. Locked Out looks forward to talking with you again next week. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.